Language may sometimes seem like it's random, but in reality, language follows some really rigid rules, and that's especially true in the realm of phonetics and phonology. So the sounds that exist in different languages, they tend to follow very rigid rules, and that extends to the sounds that exist in different dialects. And we're going to examine that with something called the trap-bath split.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
So this has nothing to do with traps, it has nothing to do with baths. Trap and bath are just example words that illustrate vowel sounds. So what we're really interested in here is the vowel sounds, and particularly the way in which these sounds differ in different dialects. Now, the trap-bath split started about 400 years ago in southern England when some people started to pronounce the ah sound a little bit differently in certain words. So let's write out the ah sound, and for simplicity's sake, we'll say that it looks like this. Now, that sound differs a little bit depending on the dialect, but for the most part, it sounds something like an ah. And about 400 years ago, when that ah sound came before a few consonants, it changed into something more like an ah sound. And that's written like this, like an ah. So it got a little bit longer. And it was specifically that change occurred when the vowel came before one of the following consonants. F, s, th, ns, nt, n, and mpl. I know that sounds ridiculous. So according to this new rule, which followed this very rigid rule, if the ah came before one of these consonant sounds, it became pronounced more like ah. So trap stayed trap, but bath all of a sudden became both. So we'll write this out. Trap stays trap, but bath, because it's got that th sound in it, became bath. And you might recognize that pronunciation as characteristic of Southern English speech.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
Now, Southern English speech has had a big influence on the way the rest of the world speaks. This is traditionally a very prestigious dialect. It doesn't mean it's any better than any other dialect, but it had a lot of political influence. So you can still see the effect of this trap-bath split in many dialects throughout the world. For example, in Indian speech, in Indian standard Indian English, this split for the most part is maintained. So here's a sample of an Indian English speaker who has a trap-bath split.
Trap, bath, trap, bath, trap, bath.
But since this change only took part in the south of England, there were still some parts of England that were not affected. Namely, everything north of the city of Birmingham, basically, was not affected. So south of Birmingham, trap-bath split, north of Birmingham, and there was no split. Still, this rings true today. If you listen to somebody from the north of England, they will say trap and bath for the most part. So here's an example of somebody from Liverpool who does not exhibit the trap-bath split.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
Now, in Australian English, which was influenced primarily by Southern English dialects, but also by some Northern English dialects, the trap-bath split does exist for most Australians. It's a little bit more dicey than it is for English people, where you can actually draw a line. This kind of imaginary line where people speak one way in one direction of it and another way in another direction of it, this is called an isogloss. I know it sounds like something out of Dr. Seuss. You have this imaginary boundary that makes people act differently, but it's really true. These rigid rules emerge in language. In Australia, because of the history of how the accent developed with immigrants from different parts of the British Isles, it's not as clear-cut as to who exhibits the trap-bath split, but for the most part, it is predominant in the Australian accent. So here are a couple of examples of Australian speakers.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
Trap, bath, trap, bath,
I think it's kind of cool that you can hear just two words that are said by somebody and kind of predict where they're from. So things get a little more interesting when you get to the United States and you introduce the "a" sound. The "a" sound. So this is actually a diphthong. It's not just a single vowel sound, but it is a combination of vowel sounds. So it's actually a movement in the mouth. "A", "a". And this pronunciation is especially prevalent in the Midwest. So in the Midwest, there is no trap-bath split. It's a trap-bath merger, but with this new vowel sound, which is the trap, and bath.
Trap and bath, trap and bath, trap and bath, trap and bath.
And then finally, this is just a little shout out to my grandparents. They are proud speakers of the Brooklyn dialect. And in the Brooklyn dialect, there is a trap-bath split, but it is with the "a" sound in trap and the "a" sound in bath. So this is called tensing. And that would sound something like this.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
Trap, bath, trap, bath.
What I love about this is that it's so predictable. It's something that our minds are completely wired to produce subconsciously and also to decode. We can hear somebody, and even if we don't know how to produce an Australian accent or a Brooklyn accent, we know when we listen to that where that person is from, which is really kind of an amazing human ability.